On behalf of the 16th Cabinet and on my personal behalf, I wish to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of you from Dharamsala. Today, we are going to discuss a little more in detail about the vision paper, this book that we launched on 10th April, and this is called Securing Tibet's Future, a vision paper. I'm taking this time out to explain the contents of the vision paper to the non-Tibetan speaking audience, particularly the younger generations of Tibetans who has to understand how the Central Tibetan administration is intending to move forward into the future and how do we secure our future. Any government or administration will or have to have a vision paper like this, and I understand that this is perhaps the first vision paper by a cabinet. Through this paper, we hope that the Tibetan advocates will have a better understanding of how the Central Tibetan administration and particularly the executive of the Central Tibetan administration intends to move forward. We have divided this vision paper into 4 parts. One is the introductory part, which also explains about the geostrategic importance of Tibet and the environmental importance of Tibet and cultural importance of Tibet. These 3 things are very useful to understand the basic information about Tibet, and this can also help you in your advocacy work to explain to people about Tibet. Oftentimes we tend to believe that people around the world know about Tibet, but unfortunately that is not the reality. We have to explain Tibet, we have to explain the people of Tibet, we have to explain about the history of Tibet, and we have to explain about the current situation inside Tibet to the international community if we have to be effective voice for our brothers and sisters inside Tibet who are suffering under the Chinese occupation. So therefore, the question is why Tibet matters. What are the benefits for China if the Sino-Tibet conflict is resolved? Or what are the benefits for the international community or for the neighborhood? So that is why it is important to talk about the geopolitical importance of Tibet. Tibet historically is located between the 2 most populous nations in the world, India and China. And because of its historical status as an independent state, it had always remained a buffer between these 2 big nations in Asia. Therefore, there has never ever been a war between India and China because there was never ever a common boundary between India and China. Only after the occupation of Tibet by the People's Republic of China in 1950, and then consequently we were forced to sign the 17-point agreement under duress. Since then, Tibet was colonized by China, and then only then did China and India have a common border, which led to the 1962 war between India and China. Geographically, Tibetans call the land of Tibet as the land or the heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges, as we say in Tibetan, Kangri Rave Kove Shinkam Dir. So on the southern border you have the Himalayas from covering all of North India, and then on the west you have the Karakoram, and in the north you have the Kunlun mountain ranges, and then on the east you have many layers of snow-capped mountain ranges that surrounded Tibet. That is why Tibetans define Tibet as the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. And when Westerners started coming into Tibet, they called Tibet as the roof of the world because of its altitude of an average of 4,000 meter meters above sea level, or a little more than 12,000 feet above sea level. Asians refer to Tibet as the water tower of Asia because all these major rivers that flows into the neighboring India and Pakistan, like the Indus and the Sutlej, or the Brahmaputra that comes into India and Bangladesh, or the smaller rivers that flows into Nepal, or the Irrawaddy or the Salween that flowing into Burma, and the Mekong originating from Tibet and going into Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, 5 different countries in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, China. The 2 lifelines of China, the Yellow and the Yangtze, also originate from the Tibetan Plateau. And if there are irreversible damages to the fragile environment of Tibet, it will have serious consequences, not only to the Tibetans, but to all the downstream riparian states, including China itself. That's why it's very important to take care of Tibet's environment. And then now Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the 3rd pole. Apart from the North Pole and South Pole, Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers. Therefore, Tibet is called as the 3rd pole. So from these designations of Tibet as a land, I hope it will give you a imaginative view of Tibet and understand the significance of Tibet from a geopolitical perspective. The climate change on Tibet is twice the speed of climate change in the rest of the world, whereas on the poles it's 3 times the climate change in other parts of the world. So therefore, any change in climatic conditions on the Tibetan Plateau will have severe consequences, not only to the Tibetan people, but to all the neighboring countries around Tibet. Therefore, the importance of Tibet cannot be discounted, and there should be proper stewardship of Tibet's environment by involving the Tibetans as stakeholders in the preservation of Tibet's fragile ecology and environment. And China is building a dam twice the size of 3 gorges on what they call as the Great Bend, where the Brahmaputra takes down southward direction. And on that place, China is building a dam twice the size of 3 Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world. So you can imagine how much land is going to be inundated upstream, and if, the whole region is seismic because the Himalayas were formed because of the movement of plates between Gondwana and Asian plates. Therefore, scientists say that Himalaya is still growing for all the downstream countries who are not able to speak up to China right now. It's time that they raise this issue, because China does not share any hydrological data with any of its downstream countries or its riparian states. The third reason why Tibet matters is to do with the spiritual and cultural influence of Tibet. Many people believe that since Tibet right now is occupied by the People's Republic of China, Tibetan language also might have something to do with Chinese language, but unfortunately that is not the case. Tibetan language came from India, and Tibetan Buddhism also came from India. We must have had the biggest transliteration house in the world in 8th century, when we translated every available Sanskrit text into Tibetan on the advice of Shantarakshita, the Indian master who visited Tibet around that time. So we are an extension of one part of the ancient Indian wisdom, and we are very proud to say that we are a repository of this very important knowledge system, which is relevant not only to the situation those days, but it's much more relevant today in the 21st century, when we hoped or expected this world to be much more peaceful, but unfortunately it turned out to be the other way around. So the Buddhism that that spread to Tibet developed its own unique characteristics, and Tibetan Buddhism also spread to many parts of Central Asia. Therefore, the influence of Tibetan Buddhism also cannot be discounted. The potential to spread peace and more nonviolence in this world has its potential in the wisdom of the Buddha. Therefore, the cultural influence of the Tibetans is also very important to bring in more peace and stability in the whole region. Now, these are the three main reasons why Tibet matters, not only to the Tibetans, but to all the neighboring countries and to the international community. Now we will talk a little bit about the current policies of the government of the People's Republic of China inside Tibet. The first thing is cultural genocide of Tibet, that we are dying a slow death culturally. Because everything that is devised by the Chinese government in terms of its policies and programs inside Tibet aimed at destroying the very identity of the Tibetan people, whether it's to do with Tibetan language or whether it's to do with Tibetan culture or religion or way of life or protection of its environment. It is of utmost importance for us to understand the situation inside Tibet and be able to tell the international community as to what exactly is going on inside Tibet. The intensive surveillance. Now, surveillance in all forms. In fact, China is the only country that spends more money on internal security than external security. That itself manifests a deep distrust between the rulers and the ruled, whether it be the Tibetans or the Uyghurs or the Mongols or the Hong Kongers. The strict surveillance is very much akin to the George Orwell's 1984 coming into reality, where the state surveils everything and the whole administrative structure has been designed in such a way that very, very similar to the German SS of before the Berlin Wall broke down. So everybody spies on everybody. China employs all kinds of artificial intelligence, whether it's in the form of electronic identification or geolocation or DNA profiling of the Tibetans or iris scanning of the Tibetans. All these are meant to use against the Tibetans to control more and more and be incarcerated in the name of national security or social stability, because most of the laws they have framed are very ambiguous and it could be interpreted at different levels by different authorities. Information is one area that Chinese government controls all the time. In the last several years, nobody has been able to move into Tibet. Nobody has been able to come out of Tibet. So it is in a way completely locked down, totally shut down from the international community. And I'm sure that many of the diplomats that have worked in Beijing will vouch for the fact that Chinese government does not appreciate diplomats or journalists going into Tibet. And even if they were allowed, they would be under strict guidance of the local guides who will be chaperoning them when they travel around Tibet, so they don't get to see the reality of the situation. If anybody is caught receiving information and distributing information, then that person lands up in big trouble. And if anybody is caught sending any information out of Tibet, then that person definitely lands up in jail, being incarcerated and tortured for his action. And now every action of an individual is linked to the welfare of all your near and dear ones. 157 Tibetans have self-immolated so far, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or hoping against hope that the international community will come to their rescue, but to no avail so far. But I keep telling my people that their contribution, the accumulation of their contribution, will not go in vain. Their efforts, their sacrifices will definitely bear fruit in the long run. There were times when one monk self-immolated in Vietnam and it became an international news, and another person self-immolated in Czech Republic in 1968. But even after 157 self-immolations, there has not been enough attention from China as well as the international community. Now, why do you think these Tibetans are self-immolating? And most of them are between the age of 17 to 35. They have never witnessed independent Tibet, or they have never witnessed cultural revolution. They only see what the Chinese government is doing to the Tibetan people right now on the ground. Striking at the very root of Tibetan identity, particularly after President Xi Jinping's assumption of power in China, there have been a lot of new policies and programs aimed at eradication of the languages of the nationalities inside China. So at one time, we did fear a lot of demographic aggression from China. Of course, the Chinese population is increasing in Tibet, but it's not increasing as much as we feared. Therefore, it looks like the Chinese government has changed its policy. If they are not able to flood Tibet with Chinese, completely overwhelming a minority community by a majority community, then the next step is how do we change the younger generations of Tibetans into Chinese? And that is exactly what they're doing through the colonial-style boarding schools. We are definitely not against education. We are definitely not against bilingualism. Education is very much necessary. Bilingualism is also important because China has 1.4 billion population out of 8 billion. So it's a sizable population, and in times to come, there will be many more people speaking Chinese. So it's important for us to learn Chinese. But what we are against is complete sinification of the Tibetan people, the young generations of Tibetan people who are taught only how to respect communism, how to abide by communist rules and laws, how to maintain allegiance to the Communist Party, and Chinese version of Tibetan history. So these are all aimed at complete sinification. And this is at a much larger scale. Of course, they do try Sinicization of Tibetans at every level in different ways, but language is at the very heart or root of our identity, and therefore China is right now striking at the very root of our identity. If this policy goes on for another 2-3 decades, then one can imagine what will happen to the younger generations of Tibetans who would be thinking, behaving, and talking exactly how, like the Chinese do. So that is a very dangerous trend, and that is something that we have to be very, very concerned about by both the Tibetans inside and the Tibetans outside Tibet, and Tibet supporters all around the world to seek and garner support in closing down these colonial-style boarding schools, and urge the Chinese government to move towards providing holistic education to the Tibetan children, particularly Tibetan language, culture, religion, and history. The politicization of religion and violation of freedom of belief. Now, from the time Tibet was independent until now, we all know that how many monasteries and nunneries have been destroyed inside Tibet. Talking about more than 6,000 monasteries and nunneries, and more than 1.2 million Tibetans having died directly or indirectly because of China's rule in Tibet. Number of monks and nuns have come down. Number of monasteries and nunneries have come down. Over the last 1.5 decade or 2 decades, the management of the monastic institutions have been taken over by multiple security agencies and the United Work Front Department. So Tibetans have no say in the management of monasteries. Tibetans don't even have a say in where they want to go. All the movements and monks and nuns are being restricted. You need at least 4 or 5 different permits if you are traveling across Tibet as a monk and nun. Then now the Chinese government also wants to be responsible for setting up the curriculum in the monasteries. The atheist Chinese government wants to be responsible for setting up curriculum in for religious studies in the monasteries. The use of the monastic areas, the religious areas, the rules have also been amended very recently to make it more difficult for Tibetan monks and nuns to undertake their regular studies and be always on the watch of the Chinese security forces. Now the Chinese government even wants to be responsible for reincarnation of lamas, what they call as living Buddhas in China. So this is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism. Even though Buddhism is there in many parts of the world, the practice of reincarnation, looking for a new soul in a new body once a person dies, is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism. Now this China is more concerned about the 15th yet to come Dalai Lama than the 14th Dalai Lama who is still living here in India. China believes that if they can get hold of the 15th Dalai Lama, then they will be able to control Tibet. But I want to tell the Chinese leaders, have you not learned enough lessons from the Panchen Lama saga? Because when His Holiness the Dalai Lama recognized his boy Khenpo Nyima as Panchen Lama in 1995, the Chinese government took offense and they selected their own Panchen Lama. And soon after, the real Panchen Lama, recognized by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, just vanished along with his family. And we still don't know whether he's alive or not, or whether he has been provided with the education for him to carry on his religious responsibilities, which we seriously doubt, even if he's alive. So the boy, Khenpo Nyima, selected by the Chinese government, is not respected by any Tibetans in any part of Tibet. And therefore, he doesn't even live in Tibet, his traditional throne in Shigatse. And whenever he travels to Tibet, people are forced to go to listen to him. And his pictures are not being sold in the Tibetan market in Lhasa. You see only the pictures of the 10th Panchen Lama. And that is how people react or show their displeasure at Chinese choice of Panchen Lama. So my question is to the Chinese leadership. I don't know whether the present leadership will be alive by that time or not, but even then, do they really want a lifelong headache on their head or not? Because if and when that time comes, if China chooses a Dalai Lama or the Tibetans choose a Dalai Lama, then this is going to go on for a whole life. So do they really want a problem? A lifelong problem or not? That is something for the Chinese leadership to think about. Now, the last part of this first section is the way forward. Now, what is the solution for this vexed conflict, for this Sino-Tibet conflict that has been lingering over the last 63 years since we came into exile, or more than 72 years since we were forced to sign this 17-point agreement? Considering the reality of the situation inside Tibet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama started thinking about the middle way approach, which is a Buddhist concept, avoiding extreme polarities. And in this case, one polarity is the situation of Tibet, the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. On the other polarity is the situation of Tibet under the occupation of the People's Republic of China. So we have to find a middle way whereby the Tibetans will have the freedom to practice its religion, promote its culture, its way of life, and protection of its environment. So these are some of the essential components of the middle way, whereby Tibetans will have the freedom to protect and practice and promote their own identity. So this idea also came into His Holiness' mind way back in 1973-74, and one can imagine the situation then. It was at a time when the Cultural Revolution was at its peak, led by the Gang of Four, Mao Zedong's wife. which culminated in 1976. From 1966 to 76, for 10 long years, everything old was being destroyed in Tibet, in the whole of China, but more so in Tibet. His Holiness really feared that the identity of the Tibetan people may not remain. And since that time, he has been proposing the middle way policy. And in the early 80s, when there were little freedom during Deng Xiaoping's time and Hu Yaobang's time, there was little respite to restore Tibetan language and Tibetan culture inside Tibet for a few years. But then again, when Xi Jinping became the party secretary, he clamped down on Tibet and introduced martial law. And since then, the situation has been deteriorating. But despite the response from the Chinese side, His Holiness has always pushed for the most reasonable approach, which is the middle way approach. Or we did send exploratory teams to explore possible negotiations between China and Tibet way back in 1982 and 84, which did not yielded the result as we expected. There was also a possibility for dialogue in 1989, which also dissipated soon after, and which was again revived in 2002. So this policy was proposed by His Holiness, was approved through opinion poll by the majority of Tibetans, and unanimously adopted by the Tibetan Parliament. So this position remains our official position. There is no change to that, but we'll definitely discuss about the change in strategy as to how to achieve this policy. We still believe that even though from 2002 to 2010 there were 9 rounds of dialogue, it could not fulfill the expectations that we had at the beginning of the dialogue. And soon after the Olympics got over, that round of dialogue also dissipated into 2010. So since 2010 to 2013, there have been no traction whatsoever on the dialogue, mainly because there is no positive response from the Chinese side. We'll discuss a little more about the way forward after that, but this is the first section where I've tried to focus in your advocacy work when you explain to other people about Tibet, about the geopolitical significance of Tibet, as to why Tibet matters, why Tibet is so important for the whole region. And if we are able to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict through the middle way approach or the policy, then this could contribute a lot towards bringing more security and stability in the whole region in Southeast Asia and Central Asia. So thank you very much for listening, and please do have a look at the vision paper. Please go through this document as much as possible, and I'm sure as I speak, Tibet.net will also display the link on Tibet.net where you can have access to these documents. Thank you very much.